It was a chilly September evening when I decided to drive from my parents' house to my friend's apartment near the college campus. The drive was about an hour and a half, and though I left late around 9 p.m., I was familiar with the route. I usually stopped halfway at a McDonald's to take a break. That night, I ended up picking up a hitchhiker, and it was a decision I would deeply regret. I saw him shortly after leaving my parents' place, just 10 to 15 minutes into the drive. He was at the exit of a roundabout, a tall, slender man with a small shoulder bag. At first, he looked like someone who had been dropped off after a party. It was too early for a party to end, but I felt a pang of sympathy and decided to stop. I rolled down the passenger window and asked where he was headed. I soon realized he was much older than I'd thought, probably in his 30s. His pale face and unsettling gaze immediately put me on edge. He was heading to the town where I planned to stop for a break. I don't know why I agreed to give him a ride. I told him it was on my way, and he got into the car. As soon as we started driving, he clutched his stomach and hunched over in the passenger seat. He kept muttering about not feeling well. I offered to open the windows, but he said he just needed his medication, which he never took. I was already feeling uneasy and knew I shouldn't stop under any circumstances. I suggested dropping him off at the McDonald's in that town. It was a well-lit parking lot, busy until midnight, and I could leave quickly onto a major road. He agreed, or at least it seemed he did. I pretended to focus on the road, trying to stay calm while he talked incessantly. He began with odd requests, asking to see my nails, which I had not painted. When I said I was driving, he apologized and then bizarrely mentioned he had never raped anyone. He rambled about his girlfriend wanting to break up with him if he didn't return. His questions became increasingly intrusive. Where I was going, what I was planning to do that night, if I took long baths, and if I had a boyfriend. I told him that was private and refused to answer. He just nodded and talked about how he used to be young until he got arrested. He insisted that we were being followed by other cars and asked if I smoked weed. I said no. He offered me a cigarette, which I declined, but he left one on the dashboard. At one point, he took out his phone to show me pictures. The screen was broken, with black lines and a disturbing mix of colors. He seemed offended when I glanced quickly at the screen and started shouting that I didn't care about what he was saying. I told him I was listening but couldn't look. He calmed down after that. He asked if the car was mine, and I said it belonged to my parents, trying to downplay any sense of wealth. I lied, saying I had recently hit a deer, to explain why I needed to focus on driving. He stared at me intently, muttering something about feeling sorry for a road sign before returning to his earlier behavior. As we approached the city, he asked if I could take him to the train station. It was nearly 10 p.m., and I knew there were no trains running at that time. I reminded him that we agreed to stop at McDonald's. He nodded and put a coin on the dashboard as a token of thanks before getting out of the car. I stopped briefly in the parking lot, not wanting to park and get out. I stayed right in the middle of the way where I felt most exposed. He left saying, "See you later." I didn't wait around. I drove away as fast as I could, never looking back. I haven't seen or heard from him since. I've learned my lesson the hard way and won't make that mistake again. I had been hitchhiking for a while, traveling across Europe without much of a plan, just letting the road take me wherever it led. Last December, I found myself in Greece, standing on the side of a dusty road near Kalamata. The air was crisp, and my body was still stiff from sleeping in my hammock behind some old castle ruins. It wasn't the most comfortable night, but after weeks on the road, I was used to it. I made my sign that morning, scribbling Athens and Sparta in Greek on a piece of cardboard. I'd been at it for a while, but the cars just passed by. Most of them were headed somewhere else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a small, worn-out white car pulled up. The driver was an older man, maybe in his 60s. He looked rough, greasy hair, missing teeth, and his skin had that tired look like he'd spent too many years out in the sun. But he was going to Sparta, so I decided to take my chance. The ride was quiet. We didn't have a shared language, so any attempt at conversation was pretty much futile. He smoked, the smell of cigarettes hanging thick in the car. After only a few kilometers, he suddenly turned off the main road, and we were soon in his yard. The place was small, tucked away on the side of a mountain, surrounded by sheep and olive trees. A dog lay lazily in the sun, barely acknowledging our arrival. He gestured for me to follow him, and I did, still unsure of what was going on. We went to a small terrace around his house, and I set my bags inside as he lit another cigarette. Through the broken communication, he offered me food and a shower, but I declined. Something felt off, and I was anxious to get back on the road. I didn't want to waste the daylight. Using a translation app, I tried to explain that I needed to keep moving, but he didn't seem to get it. Instead, he suggested I stay the night and he'd take me to Sparta the next day. That wasn't part of my plan. I got up and went inside to grab my bags. As I moved to leave, he stepped in front of me, blocking the door. He locked it, turning towards me with a look that made my skin crawl. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding, that this was his way of being hospitable, but the air in the room shifted. He wasn't joking. I felt trapped. His presence was unsettling, and for some reason my eyes locked on the blackheads scattered across his nose. He stepped closer, and a cold, sharp feeling ran through me. That's when he made a motion that left no doubt about what he wanted. I said no again and again, but he didn't care. His hand shot forward, grabbing me in a way that made my entire body go cold. I was frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening before the anger hit me. I pulled away, clenching my fists, ready to defend myself if things escalated. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, neither of us moving. Then, thankfully, he let go. I didn't waste a second. I pushed past him and out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the road stretched out in front of me, empty. As I walked away, I could see a group of hunters in the distance, their trucks parked along the road, rifles slung over their shoulders. Somehow, that sight made me feel a bit safer. I kept walking, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle on me. I tried to flag down cars, using the empty water bottle trick to make it look like I was desperate. It worked eventually. A car stopped, and I got in without thinking twice. By the time I reached Sparta, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Later that day, I made it to Athens, but the experience lingered, leaving me feeling uneasy until I could wash the grime of the day off me. Looking back, I realized how lucky I'd been. That situation could have gone much worse. I had a knife with me for safety, but it wasn't on me at the time. I'm not sure if it would have helped or just made things worse. All I know is that I walked away, and that was enough. Despite everything, hitchhiking still holds a certain appeal. There's something about the uncertainty, the freedom of the road. But that day, I learned to be more cautious. Not everyone out there has good intentions, and sometimes it's better to trust your gut than the kindness of a stranger. I was on my way to an out-of-town job assignment, driving alone, and decided to stop at a busy travel stop to stretch my legs, fuel up, and grab a quick snack. The place was packed, with people coming and going. It was just one of those ordinary stops along the highway, nothing unusual. I filled up the tank and went inside for a few minutes. That's when I noticed her, a woman probably in her mid-20s, standing near the entrance. She looked a little distressed, unsure of where to go. She approached me and asked for a ride, saying her friends had abandoned her while she was in the restroom. She didn't have a phone or know anyone's number, and she had been stuck there for a while. I felt bad for her. I asked one of the employees about her, and they confirmed she'd been there for about an hour, asking people for a lift. It seemed like no one wanted to get involved. Against my better judgment, I decided to help. I told her I wasn't going to her town, but I could drop her off at a grocery store along the way. It would be closer to her destination, and I figured she could find another ride from there or walk the remaining distance. She agreed, and we set off. Almost immediately, I noticed something strange, a van following us. It kept its distance at first, but no matter how many turns I made, it stayed behind. My gut told me something wasn't right. Meanwhile, the woman beside me was growing restless. She kept reaching for my phone, asking to play with it. I told her no. It wasn't a toy. Then, out of nowhere, she suddenly remembered a phone number. Her boyfriend's, she claimed. She wanted to call him. I couldn't make the call while driving, especially with no hands-free option available at the time. I assured her that we'd call when we reached the store, but that didn't calm her down. She started getting more agitated, insisting that I take her straight home. I tried to explain again that I couldn't do that. Her destination was out of my way, and I needed to be somewhere soon. But she didn't want to hear it. Her voice grew louder, more urgent, as she told me I had to take her home. All the while, the van behind us was closing in, inching closer and closer. Finally, I reached the grocery store parking lot. It was busy, filled with people coming and going, which made me feel a little safer. I pulled up in front of the store and asked for her boyfriend's number. Now she suddenly couldn't remember it again. I asked her to get out of the car, but she refused. The van that had been following us pulled into the parking lot too, creeping along like it was waiting for something. I spotted a sheriff's deputy parked nearby. Keeping my voice low, I waved him over. He walked up to the car and I explained the situation. The woman wouldn't get out, and the van had been following us the whole time. He leaned down to the passenger side window and calmly told her it was time to leave my car. Reluctantly, she stepped out, but before she left, she looked at me and said something that made my blood run cold. "I don't have a boyfriend. Oh, look, there are my friends now." She pointed straight at the van. The deputy and I exchanged a look, and he told me to get out of there. He said he'd check their license and registration and try to stall them while I drove away. "Don't pick up any more hitchhikers," he added as I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't stop until I was far down the road, heading toward my destination. Later that day, the deputy called me to check in, assuring me they were keeping an eye on the van and the people inside. He also said he'd alerted the local sheriff's department in the county where I was heading, just in case anything else happened. Over the next few days, I spoke with a couple of deputies and even a detective. They seemed very interested in the woman in the van, though they didn't tell me much. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something dangerous. I kept thinking about that van, the way it followed us, and the strange behavior of the woman. Maybe it was nothing, but the thought kept gnawing at me. Now every time I think about that day, I wonder if I'll ever see their faces again, on the news, in a report about a robbery or something worse. I still think about how close I might have come to being part of something terrible. Let's just say picking up strangers is no longer something I'll ever do again. I had been living in a remote, rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. Our relationship wasn't great, and that morning we had an explosive argument. He stormed out of the house, leaving me angry and frustrated. Without thinking, I threw on my coat and Uggs, grabbed my cigarettes, and left. In my rush, I didn't take my phone. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I wandered aimlessly for a while, the cold biting into my skin, the snow falling harder with each passing minute. I had no plan, just a desperate need to escape the suffocating tension. The road out of the trailer park seemed like it would lead me somewhere, so I followed it. I didn't know much about the area. I had only been living there for a few months. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and the house. Cars and trucks whizzed past me, splashing slushy snow on my legs. My ex drove by at one point, his face set in a hard, cold expression. He didn't even slow down. I had thought maybe he would come back for me, but I was wrong. I was completely alone, trudging through the snow, not sure where I was headed. The only place that came to mind was my friend's mom's house. I didn't know exactly where it was, but I had a vague idea. As the snow thickened and I grew colder, I spotted a truck parked at a VFW building up ahead. An older man sat inside, watching me as I approached. He looked ordinary enough. Gray hair, clean cut. I hesitated for a moment, my gut telling me to keep walking, but the snow was too heavy and I was exhausted. I convinced myself it would be fine and approached the truck. He offered me a ride, and against every instinct screaming at me to refuse, I got in. The moment the door closed behind me, the atmosphere shifted. It felt heavy, oppressive. As we drove, he started asking casual questions: where I was going, why I was walking in the middle of nowhere, why I wasn't wearing proper winter gear. I explained about the fight with my boyfriend, trying to keep my tone light. But as soon as I mentioned being from the Bronx, something in his eyes changed. There was an awkward pause before he asked if I was looking to make some money. My heart sank. I forced a nervous laugh and politely declined, hoping that would end it. But the way he watched me, eyes lingering too long, made it clear he had other plans in mind. He seemed to think my being from the Bronx somehow justified his assumption, as if that meant I was used to dealing with creeps like him. I tried to stay calm, my mind racing as I mentally mapped out my surroundings. There were no houses, no signs of life, just a desolate stretch of road disappearing into the woods. Then, without warning, he veered off the main road. My pulse quickened as I realized he was taking me somewhere remote, somewhere hidden. I glanced out the window at the dense forest on either side of the truck and panic clawed at my chest. I was trapped. I kept talking, trying to act casual, trying not to let him see how terrified I was. I mentioned my friend's mom and blurted out her name, hoping it would change his mind. He didn't react right away, just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. The road became narrower, winding through thick trees. I couldn't see any way out. The truck slowed, and for a brief moment, I thought about throwing open the door and jumping into the snow. But the speed, the depth of the snow, there was no guarantee I'd make it far. Suddenly, he stopped the truck. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. He turned to face me, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I was in real danger. He reached for me, his hand grabbing my arm, the grip strong and menacing. My mind screamed for me to run, but his grip was firm. I struggled to pull free, but he tightened his hold, a twisted smile spreading across his face. I had to act fast. Without thinking, I yanked my arm free with all the strength I had and flung myself toward the door. It wasn't locked. I hit the ground hard, the icy snow biting into my skin, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The snow was deep and every step felt like I was sinking into the earth, but I kept going. My lungs burned with every breath, my legs aching with the effort. I could hear him behind me, his boots crunching in the snow. He was gaining on me. My eyes scanned the horizon, desperate for anything that looked like safety. Up ahead, through the trees, I saw a faint light. Maybe a house, a cabin, something. I had no choice. I had to make it there. I pushed myself harder, my muscles screaming in protest. His footsteps were so close now, I could almost feel his presence right behind me. But the light was getting closer. I just had to reach it. I stumbled into a clearing, and there it was, a small house, its windows glowing faintly in the fading daylight. Without thinking, I sprinted to the front door, slamming my fist against it, my voice hoarse as I screamed for help. The door creaked open and a woman appeared, startled by my frantic state. I didn't wait for her to ask what was wrong. I pushed past her into the house and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My body trembled with fear and exhaustion, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a few seconds I stood there, my back pressed against the door, listening. I could hear his footsteps outside, pacing back and forth, but he didn't approach. Maybe the sight of the house had spooked him, or maybe he was waiting for the right moment to make his move. I didn't care. I wasn't going back outside. The woman who had let me in didn't ask many questions. She just stared at me, confused and alarmed, as I collapsed onto her couch. I never saw him again after that night. but the memory of those cold, empty eyes will haunt me forever. He didn't get me that day, but the fear still lingers, reminding me just how close I came to disappearing without a trace. It was late summer 1993, and I was living in Montana. My boyfriend was in British Columbia, so I made frequent trips between the two places. We were broke and didn't have a car, so hitchhiking was our main mode of transportation for longer distances. After spending August with him, it was time for me to head back to school. With no money from summer work and no support from my parents or friends, I found myself in a tight spot. My boyfriend didn't come through with any cash for a bus ticket, and I didn't want to resort to panhandling. I needed to get back and couldn't wait for his money to materialize. This would be my first time hitchhiking alone. I packed up my backpack, ensuring I had my ID, lesson learned from a previous trip where I'd forgotten it and had trouble at the border, and set off. The beginning of the trip went smoothly. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got out of the mountains and into town. They drove me all the way to Creston, right near the border. I crossed into the U.S. and was quickly picked up by a guy who, while a bit creepy, only talked about how dangerous it was to hitchhike alone and how I reminded him of his daughter. He drove me to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, covering a significant portion of my journey. My luck seemed to be holding. I walked to the outskirts of the city, stuck my thumb out, and waited. Hours passed with no luck. While walking, I found a piece of cardboard and planned to make a sign at the next gas station. Just as I picked up the cardboard, I noticed a small, thin snake struggling to climb over the cement guardrail. I liked snakes and decided to help it over. Little did I know that would turn out to be a bad omen. Soon after, a car slowed down and stopped. As I approached, I saw a man with a young boy in the front seat. My initial instinct was to be cautious, but since there was a child present, I felt a bit safer and decided to get in. The man introduced himself as Tom and said the boy was his nephew. They were heading to St. Louis after visiting Tom's brother in Seattle. The kid was quiet, barely saying a word. The drive was supposed to be about 3 hours. For the first hour, Tom chatted amiably, sharing stories and small talk. I kept my switchblade hidden in the bottom of my palm, just in case. As time went on, Tom's questions turned increasingly inappropriate. He asked about my boyfriend, our likes and dislikes, and then, the worst of all, about our favorite intimate activities. My anxiety skyrocketed. I tried to play along while frantically thinking of how to escape. Tom's behavior became more unsettling as he took swigs from a drink in the console, his demeanor growing increasingly erratic. He made it clear he expected something in return for the ride, and his request for me to find one of my friends for his nephew only made my stomach drop further. Realizing I needed to act fast, I concocted a plan. I smiled and told Tom I'd set him up with a date with a hot friend of mine. We were nearing my town, so I asked him to stop at a gas station to buy some beer first, knowing it was a few blocks from where I lived. Tom reluctantly agreed and went inside. As soon as he was inside, I opened my door and sprinted down an alley. I dove into a dense clump of bushes, crouching low and trying to stay as quiet as possible. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. I kept my knife ready, clutching it tightly. I remained hidden until it was dark, listening for any sign of Tom. I didn't hear his car or see any headlights. Finally, when it was fully dark, I made a run for home. I could hear Tom yelling in the distance, but his car never came down the alley. I reached my front door, locked it, and collapsed inside, covered in dirt and leaves. My roommate looked at me in shock and asked what had happened. I gave her a quick rundown of the story, and she said she would have picked me up at the border if I'd called her. I was shaken, but relieved to be safe at last.